So now we enter the area of the supplemental information on justice theories, and we will spend a little bit more time talking about some concepts that really the textbook doesn't get into too much detail on, which is the original position and what it means to make a decision under the veil of ignorance. How do we ensure that we have a fair outcome, and it has to be done under the veil of ignorance. So, as we move on to the discussion on fair outcomes, it's important to recognize that what I consider to be fair is not the same thing that you would consider to be fair, because what is fair depends on the eyes of the beholder, if you will. So, my life, my experiences, my point of view, my perspectives guide me to believe something is or isn't fair, just like your experiences and your opportunities and your perspectives help you to determine what is fair. So not everybody agrees on what is fair. So therein lies some of our challenges when it comes to justice theories, is not really having a common agreement on what is considered to be fair or not fair. So there are a number of different ways that we can determine, um, try to come up with a fair system, whatever that might be. And one way to do that is what we call equal opportunity. Doesn't mean that everybody is treated necessarily the same, but it means that everybody gets equal opportunity. And equal opportunity also takes into account, or needs to take into account, that not everybody's on the same level playing field. There are some people competing for jobs that went to the best schools and they have more money and they don't have debt. And so they have different opportunities, and those who have more debt or went to uh, uh, a lesser prestigious university, and had to work hard while they were in school and take out student loans. So when people are going out and trying to set up um, their lives and set up their homes and to develop a life after college or high school or whatever it is that someone chooses to do, that there isn't necessarily a fairness in treating everybody the same, because not everybody is the same. So equal opportunity is not saying that we treat everybody the same. It says we give everybody the same opportunity. But in order to do that, we have to make sure that everybody has experiences. So the lottery principle is another way that we can think about how do we determine what is fair, what is a fair outcome. And so we can do a fair outcome can be done through lottery, through luck or randomness, right? Put everybody's name in a hat and pull out a name, and that's the person who wins, and that's fair, right? Because everybody has equal opportunity to go into the pot and get their name pulled out of the pot. So that sense of lottery principle also can help determine a fair outcome. Then we can talk about the need, and a welfare principle. Who needs something versus somebody else? So if we need something, should we be given that? Is that fair? Like, I need something, but you don't, so could I get that opportunity? And then that would help me then to be able to compete. There again, people that don't have same educational opportunities, they need some supplemental education, some supplemental support in order to be able to compete on a level playing field with people who have more advanced education and more advanced opportunities. So the notion of need can also drive what we consider to be fair. Those who are the neediest should get support. We also have to think about the neediest in terms of who is the worst off. Can we help them to compete? So need and neediest are kind of the same. Potentiality, who is most likely to succeed? So should we give to everybody, even if it gets wasted on some people who are not able to compete? Or do we actually invest in those who have the greatest opportunity? And you'll see organizations do this when they identify what they call high potential employees. I'm not sure I like that principle, but it is in fact a practice that people are engaged in. They see people who are high potential employees and they are more likely to invest more money or time and effort into grooming them and getting them ready for promotional opportunities. And the thing with potentiality is we have one sense of what is high potential and what is not. What if there's bias in our determination of who has potential and who doesn't? And so there are a lot of different ways that we can think about um, what is considered to be fair, and there's more on the next page. Other ways we can determine fair outcomes might be by desert or who deserves the outcome. So the answer to that question, of course, is complex because do we give it to the most accomplished person or the best leader or the greatest potential, as we talked about in the previous page? What criteria will we use to determine who deserves an outcome and who does not deserve a certain outcome? Then we can also make a decision as a fair outcome based on utility and who can use it to create the most value for others. So very, kind of utilitarian, greatest good for the greatest number of people. Is that a fair outcome? Is utilitarianism fair? You know, a Rawlsian approach would be who will improve the well-being of the worst off, and that's Rawls's perspective. Is I am okay giving you more because by helping you to accomplish what you need to accomplish because that improves the worst off. And Rawls's argument at the end of the day is it's fair and it's good and it's ethical if the least advantaged get the support that they need in order to be able to thrive and survive. There are other, of course, reasons where we can determine what is fair. It could be, based on age, gender, color, skin color, height, and people will think it's fair because I am a certain skin color and not another, and not that skin color. I'm fair because it's this skin color. It's fair because I'm oldest or youngest, or I'm a male versus female, or female versus someone who's transgender versus someone who is gender non-binary. So there's the end of the day, recognize that what one person thinks is fair is not what another person thinks is fair. And it is incredibly challenging to come up with a shared perspective on what is considered to be fair. Because literally, you could sit two toddlers, next to each other and say, I have 3 cookies and I have to divide it between 2 kids. The oldest child will say, I deserve 2 cookies because I'm the oldest. The younger child might say, well, I deserve 2 cookies because I'm the youngest, I'm the baby. Or, I at least deserve to have 1.5 cookies versus your 1.5 cookies. Cut that in half so we all get the same. What is fair to the youngest child is not always what is considered fair to the oldest child, and vice versa. So, recognize if any time we make a decision, if we make it based on what one person thinks is fair, it's not always going to be the same for everybody else. So Rawls is looking at how do we ensure a fair distribution of resources, I guess, or benefits, societal benefits. How do we ensure social cooperation? And we ensure social cooperation if everybody makes decisions under the veil of ignorance, or, as they say, the original position. And I'm not sure why he calls it the original position. I'm sure there's some, deep theoretical reason, but as if you remember the veil of ignorance, that's helpful, and that will be the guideline. So imagine there's a veil over your head, and you don't know anything about yourself. You don't know anything about anybody else. All you know is, if I do this, would this be considered a fair decision? Would this be a fair outcome for people? And the importance of doing that is because it's about recognizing that I can easily bias a decision because I want it to benefit me. And I need to be able to make decisions to be as fair as possible by ignoring any benefit or harm that would come to me and simply argue, is this the right thing to do? Would it affect somebody harshly? Even if it doesn't affect me, if it affects somebody else harshly, would that be the right thing to do? And so, in a way, it's kind of like empathy and being able to walk in somebody else's shoes. And it's just like, under the veil of ignorance, if I don't know, anything about who I am or about who you are, would I want this to be done to me? Would I want this to be done to anybody else? Assuming that I don't know what my means are to combat that problem, is it the right thing to do? And is it something that we could do to everybody? Like, it wouldn't matter. Like, I could universally do this to all different people and it wouldn't matter. So you can start to see a little overlap, if you will, with universalism here, where he's sort of taking universalism and he's going a little bit further, and he's saying, if I do this under the veil of ignorance, this is how I can decide maybe what that moral imperative might be. That I agree that this is the right thing to do because I believe, I'm setting aside my own biases and I'm setting aside my own self-interest to be able to look at this as objectively as possible. And so his goal is to help us to set aside any personal considerations, whether they are relevant or irrelevant, that might influence us to make a decision one way or the other. So the goal is we get social cooperation when everybody says, is this the right thing to do? Would this hurt you? Would this harm you? Could it harm me? Is this the right thing to do regardless of anybody's status? Would we want to be treated that way? Would you want to be treated that way? And then we make the decision based on that. So Rawls argues what is the right choice or the right decision is what leads to greater cooperation and greater fairness. So we want a society that cooperates with each other, that has each other's back, that is considering the welfare and impact on other people. So greater cooperation, we don't want it to be coerced, but we want people to honestly say, you know what, I don't know if I would be harmed, and so therefore I want to do this to make sure I mitigate any potential harm that might be done to somebody. And again, we could think about this when it comes to masking, right? And the whole masking thing when it comes to COVID. The goal was to have greater cooperation, and the goal was to have people say to themselves, in the original position, I would not know whether or not I could get COVID and whether or not it might have deadly or negative impacts on me. So therefore, does it make sense for me to wear a mask? And under the veil of ignorance, the answer would be yes, because we don't know whether or not COVID would have affected us one way or the other. On the one hand, of course, right, we've got my rights and my individual rights to not be infringed upon. Yes. And on the other hand, we also have this notion of distributive justice, which would argue what's good for the collective, what's good for the community, what's good to get cooperation and fairness among everybody, and to treat everybody with dignity. And that would be to mask in that situation. So at the end, it's about the social contract, about how the reasonable person would want another reasonable person to act towards them without knowing what their self-interest would be or how they would or would not benefit from a decision. Under the ethical lens inventory, this is what we call the relationship lens. And that relationship lens is about, again, it's about this justice lens. And how do it's a relationship because, again, what we're trying to do is get greater cooperation for the community and the communal interests. Hence, it's called the relationship lens. So Rawls would contend that a fair decision is one that is impartial, because that's really what the veil of ignorance is trying to get at. He said if we act impartially, if we act without knowledge of how we would benefit or be hurt by a decision, but simply to look at it objectively and impartially and make that decision, that would be considered fair. And, we all have to ask ourselves, do we agree or not agree with that? And again, I wouldn't expect 100% agreement on this, simply because all of us carry a very different ethical lens that is framed by our upbringing and our experiences and all those sorts of things in life. Rawls would contend that it is that the best way to make a decision, a fair decision, is to be impartial, but not everybody and not every theory would agree with that. This slide really offers a great illustration of what would be considered a fair distribution under the veil of ignorance and without the veil of ignorance. So let's look at the bottom picture first, the pie distribution without the veil of ignorance. Typically what we might do is make a decision, even if it's unconsciously, that would benefit ourselves first and foremost, because that's what people do. It's sort of self-preservation, if you will. We will make decisions to benefit ourselves. But if we were to do it under the veil of ignorance, we would decide, no, what is fair should be something entirely different, and we might distribute things in a different way if we didn't know we would benefit or not benefit from a decision. So that the drawing on the top basically implies, under the veil of ignorance, we would want to make sure everybody benefited equally, right? And you might argue, okay, is it fair to treat everybody the same? Again, I would say probably no. But if I don't know, I'm trying to be as impartial as possible. If I don't know how I would benefit or not benefit, then my goal is to just to distribute to be as fair as possible in that manner, dividing it up equally if need be. But again, there's all sorts of criteria that we can determine about what is considered to be fair. I think this drawing kind of gives us a better picture of what Rawls is talking about when he says where you're at in society and what our original position is. And we need to set aside our original position under the veil of ignorance to be able to make this determination. But this is a great example of how, depending on who you are and where you are in society, some things might seem fair and other things might not be. If you're in the food chain and you're the smallest and at the bottom of the food chain, there is nothing fair in the world because you're always going to get eaten. And if you're at the top of the food chain, everything is just and fair because you're going to just continue to go about your life doing what you always do, getting the resources and the benefits without even thinking about it because you believe that you deserve it for whatever reason. And then there are those that might be in the middle of that food chain that say, sometimes it's kind of fair when I get to eat the little fish, and sometimes it's not so fair when I get eaten. So what we consider to be fair is dependent on the original position. So given that, we need to wear the veil of ignorance in order to be able to make as an impartial decision as we can. And here's yet another example of the difference between equality and equity. In the first drawing, what we see is kids that are standing on boxes. Everybody has gotten the same distribution. And in the first image, we see that the taller kid is standing on the same box as the shorter kid, but the shorter kid can't see, the taller kid can. And they didn't really need the box. The middle kid needed it, and it worked out fine. But everybody's got the same thing, but recognizing that not everybody comes from the same perspective, right? In the second image, the individuals are given support based on what they need, right? And so that's considered fair or equitable because those who need something more will get more, and those who don't need won't need it, and they're fine based on what it is that they're hoping to do, right? Which is to be able to see the baseball game in from behind the fence. The third image is really about what is just or fair in the long run. And this is about removing systemic barriers. So instead of trying to solve the problem after the problem happens and to remedy the problem after the fact, what we're trying to do is remove the barrier in the first place so that the outcomes are fair for everybody. If you remove the inequities in people's backgrounds and the upstream situation, right? Then the downstream solution would be everybody then has the same opportunity. So what that means, what that translates in is if there are educational disparities resulting in different educational outcomes and different job-related outcomes because of those educational disparities, then wouldn't it make sense for us to fix the educational disparities so that creates equal opportunity once people are done with their education and ready to go out and find a job? That's the goal, right? And so you can see, again, equality, it might seem like that's right or fair, right? Under the veil of ignorance, we want everybody to have the same, but we recognize also, maybe it's not fair. Maybe what we really do need to know is if we're going to have unequal distribution, we need to make sure that those who are hurt, that those who have unequal access are being benefited the most in society. So that's what we see in the second picture. Is the first picture is like, yeah, we'd like to have a fair distribution and as impartial as possible. That's our goal. But absent that, because we know that people need different things, it's okay for it to be unequal as long as the inequality benefits those that are the most disadvantaged. And so we lift up the ones that are the most disadvantaged to create that sense of fairness and a level playing field. That's the goal. So to wrap up that thought, fairness assumes a level playing field and that equal access to opportunity is really what's best at the end. But that assumes that there's a level playing field. But there isn't. We know that there's not. So if we're going to have differences, it's because we're trying to boost those that are the most disadvantaged. And that is really what Rawls is telling us, that if we can have a level playing field, yes, equal distribution to everybody. But without a level playing field, the inequalities can happen only if that boost helps those who are most disadvantaged. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of Rawls's distributive justice theories? The strength, of course, is that it protects those who are most disadvantaged. It protects many people, And it encourages ethical decisions among workers because it's about doing the right thing and doing what is fair for people. The weaknesses are trying to identify what we mean by what is just. Are we talking about a just process? Are we talking about a just outcome? Because those are two separate things. They're related to each other, but they're still separate ideas. A fair outcome can happen even if it might not have been a fair process. I know that sounds weird, but it's true, right? It can be an unfair process maybe because someone was biased, but at the end of the day, it might have been the right decision. So this has to do with intentions, right? The intention behind it versus the outcome. And what it's arguing here is, there's fair process and then there's fair outcomes, and they're very different. It ignores individual efforts and discourages differences. And so that's why when we talk about a fair distribution of things, it's about giving everybody the same thing. It doesn't take into account how different people are, except where he says inequalities can only happen when it benefits the least privileged. And it's a flawed assumption to assume that an equal distribution will ensure cooperation. That's not always true. If we give everybody the same thing, that doesn't mean people are going to cooperate and do whatever it takes to get everybody to get the same thing. There are still people that are going to engage in self-interest and do what benefits them before anybody else. So that's not always a guarantee. Distributive justice also ignores inheritance rights, right? When we think about, I've worked hard for my money, I'm going to leave an inheritance for my children so that they have something that they can depend on, I have the means to do that. Does that mean that I shouldn't do that for my kids? Is that unfair for me to give that inheritance to my children? And that was one of the big arguments that people have in terms of wealth stays with the wealthy, and that feels unfair to some people. And for others, it feels completely fair because they worked hard for it. So you can see where there are some challenges and some questions about what is considered to be fair. Depends on what perspective you're taking. And why do we have to assume everybody should get the same rights? And most ethical theories would argue we all do, but what is the authority that says we should? You know, is it what's common sense? Is it because it's more of a deontological argument that God or some supreme being said that we should do this? It's hard to know. And then lastly, recognizing that as much as we want to make the world fair, it's kind of not. you know, we can work hard and still lose, and that's life. It has nothing to do with what is fair or not fair. It's just this is the way life goes. We're on this planet. We have free will, and we have the right to work hard for things or not work hard for things. And the world isn't always fair. Even if we work hard, we don't always get what we need. So there's a difference between what theoretically we would like to see and in practicality what we end up seeing, which is as very different outcomes.